Well, welcome everyone to China, the Academy, and the American National Interest, this webinar from the National Association of Scholars. My name is Rachelle Peterson, and I'm Policy Director here at NAS, and I'm so glad that you are able to join us today. Today we're going to talk about how the Chinese government has sought to influence American higher education and the broader implications that has for the rest of our society. Many of you know that a few years ago, NAS helped to draw attention to one tool of the Chinese government, Confucius Institutes. These are Chinese government-sponsored centers on college campuses around the world, including at about 80 right now in the United States. These centers quash academic freedom. They present students a sanitized Chinese Communist Party approved view onto the Chinese government, and they really are antithetical to the purpose of higher education. We have advocated for the closure of Confucius Institutes, and we are really glad that in the last 3 years, more than 40 have closed here in the United States. There are still about 80 operating, and we're advocating for the closure of those as well. So actually just today, we released an updated toolkit for anyone who's interested in advocating for the closure of Confucius Institutes. On our website today, we have an updated toolkit on some ideas and tools for what you can do to advocate for that. It's at nas.org. But there are other tools that the Chinese government uses. The 1,000 Talents Plan compromises scholars and researchers and entices them to steal sensitive research and technology and bring it back to China. Just in February, the chair of Harvard's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department, Charles Lieber, was arrested and charged with lying about his participation in the 1,000 Talents Plan. The Chinese government had been giving Lieber monthly $50,000 payments, a stipend for living expenses, and $1.5 million to set up a lab at Wuhan University of Technology. And meanwhile, there is some disturbing news coming out of Australia, where the number 2 ranked university there, the University of Queensland, has just expelled senior philosophy student Drew Pavlou for, quote, prejudicing the university's reputation by drawing attention to and protesting the university's close ties to the Chinese government. The University of Queensland not only has a Confucius Institute, but it also has 4 courses sponsored by the Chinese government. It has also installed the Chinese Consul General in Brisbane as an honorary professor at the university, and the university's vice chancellor is also a senior consultant to the Hanban, which is the Chinese government agency that oversees Confucius Institutes. So there are lots of issues to discuss here and to think about, and today we have 3 panelists joining us to give us some perspective on these issues. We have Jonas Parello-Plesner, Steve Mosher, and Sarah Cook. And I'll go ahead and introduce each of them and then give a little overview about what the format is going to be. Jonas is the executive director of Alliance of Democracies Foundation and a non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He is the co-author of the book China's Strong Arm, Protecting Citizens and Assets Abroad. Steve Mosher is president of the Population Research Institute, a nonprofit that exposes human rights abuses related to population control in China and elsewhere. He is the author of many books, including recently Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. And Sarah Cook is the senior research analyst for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. She directs the China Media Bulletin, a monthly digest on media freedom in China, and she's the author of multiple reports for Freedom House. So we'll have about 10 minutes per panelist. We'll go Jonas, then Steve, and Sarah. And then we'll have some discussion amongst the panelists and then some Q&A from the audience. If you're watching this webinar, there is at the bottom of the screen a little Q&A button. If you click on that, you can type in your questions throughout the webinar. Some of them other panelists or I may choose to answer in real time, typing out responses to you, and others we may take up for discussion at the end, but feel free to use that as we go along. And Jonas, why don't you start us off?
Well, thank you. Thanks, and thanks for having me join. And sorry that I was a bit late. I'm here now. Just had a minor thing with and I'm in Europe, so it's 8. You can hear me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, good. So let me say a little bit where I come at this from. I mean, I come at this from having worked with China for many years, both as a diplomat and in sort of think tanks and foreign policy. So my sort of approach to this whole, when we discuss China and education, has been China and the Chinese Communist Party more broadly, of how it increasingly, I mean, we're doing this today on the 4th of June, where it's the sort of commemoration of the Tiananmen massacre. At that time, we were all focused on how could there be more freedom and rights inside China. And I think what's become increasingly clear when you study China is that China over the last decade or even longer has been able to influence abroad in democracies much more, and both influence and interfere. I use those two with the distinction where influence is when it's state-owned, state-driven Chinese actors, but where you're aware that it's where they're from, and I would say interfere when it's more covered and you're not necessarily aware that the funding or the people in question are actually acting on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's, and in particular, it's an entity within the Chinese Communist Party called the United Front, that classically sort of had mostly to do with taking care of Chinese diaspora, but has had a sort of much increasingly broader mission to make in short, the foreign serve China. And that's what we see in a lot of areas, from media to business in particular. I mean, just these days here with what's going on in Hong Kong, we see that definitely through Chinese pressure, for example, that HSBC, Standard Chartered, have sort of given their acknowledgement to the new national security law, a way of sort of putting pressure through business instead of like sort of classical try to sort of push state positions. So just to sort of a little bit give that framework of that's where I'm coming from to this issue. And then education, higher education is of course, and universities is one among other factors where we see the Chinese sort of and the Chinese Communist Party sort of have these sort of influence and interference. So that's just to give, I would say, a little bit of a framework. And then I think one of the big issues, of course, is that we'd had to sort of cope with over the last is how to deal with Confucius Institutes, which I imagine that we will talk all of us quite a bit about, but also other ways of funding universities. I think now being back in Europe, I was before this based 5 years in the US. I mean, particularly in the US, where you have that funding coming from many private donors to universities. There's of course a question of, do you have Chinese Communist Party affiliates or sort of middlemen that give gifts, and there of course are some big issues around sort of transparency to make sure that that gifts and their ultimate origin are probably registered. So that's one set of issues around higher education. Then there's the Confucius. And then, of course, there's the question of students, Chinese students, which are in general a good thing. I mean, it's great that Chinese students go abroad, study abroad. But of course, here we've also seen examples of in US universities and elsewhere, party cells being formed, Chinese Communist Party cells being formed in universities, and also that student action at universities, in some cases, have been sort of directed or even sort of instructed from the Chinese embassy. And here, of course, that creates some really interesting dilemmas between freedom of expression. That's of course a sacrosanct thing at a university, and on the other hand of saying, well, if this is directly instructed from a Chinese embassy or the state entity, then you can of course more classified as a sort of a foreign agent type of operation. So I think all of these issues are some of the ones that are, after coming back to Europe, it's also an issue I've been talking with people in Brussels about. It's something that there's an increasing awareness about in Europe as well. We've seen in Sweden, for example, that early on had several Confucius Institutes, that all of these have been closed down. But of course, again, it's a tricky balance, because we would want to see, as somebody who's studied China for years, I mean, and have my son also studying Chinese. I mean, we would like to see as many people be having access to Chinese language opportunities. So I think when in cases where Confucius Institutes are closed down, particularly in the US, when I wrote a report about this, I think it's important that then there is some alternative public funding, because otherwise a lot of, I would say, smaller universities, when I looked at that time, had taken up Confucius Institute, because it was also just a way of actually get Chinese language instruction for the university. So it's not an easy one where you just say, okay, just cut off all of them, which sounds easy, but then at the same time, you also want to create independent Chinese research that's, and there should be some public or private funding for that. So some of those, maybe the last one can be a little bit on research in sensitive areas as well, which particularly high technology at universities, where there's also been an increasing focus on both intellectual property theft, then goes back to China, and also all the way over to sort of what can be classified as sort of even espionage and sort of handing over secrets to a foreign power. So all of these things are also there in the mix. Then maybe my last point before I would just say that, particularly in this climate right now in the US, with all the polarization, and that I, as a European that deeply love US democracy and freedom, is very sad to see. I think it's important to tread very, very carefully with these things. I mean, when we do recommendations on what do we then do about it, so that it doesn't become a sort of general China scare or something. It's about making sure that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have sort of influence and negatively affects our freedoms in institutions such as universities. But it's not about basically sort of curbing Chinese presence sort of writ large. I think that's, for me, increasingly important, because we saw this also here during the pandemic with Asian Americans that were targeted and so on. So it can easily also, of course, slide over into something that's really unwarranted.
Thank you, Jonas. You flagged a lot of issues that I do hope we'll come back to and discuss more in the discussion period a little bit later. But first, Steve, let me turn to you. You're up next.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here with you today and with everyone watching from the United States and abroad. I've been concerned about the Confucius Institute since almost the beginning of that program, because I became aware of the words of then Politburo member Li Changchun, who bragged in 2011 speech at the Beijing headquarters of the Confucius Institutes, which of course is also Hanban, which is run by the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party. Quote, Politburo member Li said, quote, "The Confucius Institute is an appealing brand for extending our culture abroad. It has made an important contribution towards improving our soft power. The Confucius brand has a natural attractiveness. Using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical. Confucius Institutes," he went on to say, "are an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup. Again, using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical, And the Confucius Institutes are an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about the purpose of the Confucius Institute in the minds of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think here of the statement of General Secretary Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, that is. He's also president for life and chairman of the Military Commission. He said, repeating Chairman Mao's famous words, that the Chinese Communist Party has three magic weapons. And the three magic weapons are propaganda, united front efforts to penetrate and subvert foreign organizations. And then when those two fail, then the third magic weapon, of course, is a weapon indeed. It's the People's Liberation Army. So Xi Jinping, who is modeling himself on all things, has made no secret about the tremendous effort that is being made in united front area and in propaganda areas around the world. I mean, literally tens of billions, $10+ billion have been spent on this effort over the last few years. This is a major effort. It dwarfs anything that's done by the United States Information Agency, by the German government, by any other government around the world, probably all total, all put together. So this is what we're looking at when we look at the Confucius Institutes. We're looking at what I call Trojan horses with Chinese characteristics. That, of course, is a play on socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is the governing ideology now of the Chinese Communist Party. And just to drive the point home further, I would quote also former Communist Party leader Hu Jintao, who in remarks made to the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party in 2011 said, quote, through many years of effort, we have now found the way to cultivate and prepare foreign supporters for our party, establishing and spreading the various Chinese language institutes such as Confucius Institutes around the world increases our party's influence worldwide. I think that's pretty clear. And we can say what we want about, from an American perspective, about the Confucius Institutes looking from the outside in. But it's very important to get inside the mind of the Chinese leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and reflect on what they're using the Confucius Institutes as a tool to accomplish, because that explains an awful lot. It explains why the three T's, Taiwan, Tiananmen, and Tibet, are forbidden topics at the Confucius Institute. So lest we dwell on that too long, let me just say that I feel a great sense of anguish today on June 4th, because I remember quite well the massacre that occurred in the streets of China's capital city on June 4th, 1989, when 200,000 troops of the People's Liberation Army moved into the city. And in the immediate aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre, I took a trip around the world. I went to Hong Kong, I went to France, I came back to the United States. I interviewed a number of the pro-democracy activists who had escaped from China on the Underground Railroad, even as they were being hunted down by the Chinese Communist Party's Ministry of Public Security and State Security. And I will tell you this about the massacre. In their view, 10,000 people were killed initially in the streets of Beijing, in and around the square and in the city, throughout the city that same night. But in the following day, an even bigger tragedy occurred, which has not been generally remarked upon, because the following day, lines of People's Liberation Army trucks pulled up in front of all the hospitals and medical clinics in the city of Beijing. And what they did was the soldiers carted off the wounded, ripping out their IVs, taking them out of the intensive care units, and threw them on the backs of trucks and hauled them to an unknown destination. The reason why we don't see people walking around the streets of Beijing today missing feet and arms and legs and having scars from bullet wounds is because I believe all the witnesses were eliminated after that point. So the real death toll of the Tiananmen massacre is probably not 10,000, but in the tens of thousands. And finally, on the situation in Hong Kong, I lived in Hong Kong for several years. I learned to speak Chinese at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, which is why I speak Mandarin and Cantonese. I had to learn Cantonese because I was living with a Cantonese family, and if I wanted to eat, I had to ask for food. and learn to use not Kuaizi, but Faizi, which is how you say Kuaizi in Cantonese. So every year since the Tiananmen massacre, the Free City of Hong Kong has been the only place in China where people have been allowed to mourn and memorialize the lives that were lost and the hope for democracy that was lost in Tiananmen Square on June 4th. This year, for the first time, that memorial ceremony has been banned. It's been banned on the pretext of COVID-19, but we all know the real reason. The real reason it's been banned is because it is a memorialization. It's a remembrance of an event that the Chinese Communist Party wants everyone to forget, wants to shove down the memory hole and turn to dust. And we should not ever allow that to happen.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for reminding us about the gravity of the date that we're holding this on. You're reminding me of one of the interviews I did when I was doing case studies of Confucius Institutes. And at one university, I interviewed the university librarian her university had a Confucius Institute, and the library was being asked to catalog books donated by the Hanban and put them in the university library system. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and told me how she had lost friends at Tiananmen Square, and she was being asked to catalog these books sent over by the Hanban that just totally denied what happened on that day. And just a really poignant and powerful reminder of the kinds of censorship that are going on in China and that are being imported into our universities as well.
Yes, absolutely. I took a Tiananmen survivor into my home in California after she escaped from China. So I lived through that in a very personal way.
Thank you. Sarah, let me turn to you next.
Sure, and it's fitting that Rachelle mentioned the interviews she did, because I was actually going to start with my remarks. Highly recommending the report that she wrote and was published a few years ago, and sharing with you, hopefully I'll do it accurately, I think some of the main points that really emerged from it, but I really would encourage you to read it. I think beyond just the general finding, kind of going through the case studies one at a time. She actually visited, I think it was 12, right? University campuses in New York and New Jersey. And, you know, hearing about what was going on there, the specific dimensions and aspects of how the Confucius Institute operates there, and the various ways, which I'll talk about in a minute, that it really, in the way it's arranged and set up, it basically undermines academic freedom and other aspects of democratic rights and best practices in higher education. And then at the end, there's actually, she compiled a list of the different courses that the Confucius Institutes, that's one of the appendices, teach. And one of the things that was striking for me is that even though it's really pitched as Chinese language courses, and of course that's the vast majority, there are many other courses being taught. And I think especially, I might not be remembering off the top of my head, but I think it was at Rutgers that there was like something like the Chinese economy in the 21st century or something like that, or Chinese political economy, something that was really like a political science, economic, social science type course. And I don't remember if it was for credit or not, but I think the point was this kind of, you know, expanding mandate, and the way in which once the Confucius Institutes kind of got a foothold, you know, it wasn't just about Chinese language, but really, you know, talking and teaching about China, about many more aspects of China that are, of course, very relevant and, you know, portraying the, you know, the party's view of it, that go far beyond simply language instruction. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about two other ways from my own research that I've seen this kind of creeping mandate and activity from the Confucius Institutes in ways in which these end up serving as really a hub for extending other forms of networking and influence into other parts of American society or other societies where the Institute, other countries where the Institute is based. So again, hopefully I'll do justice to Rachelle's research. But I think a few of the ways in which, you know, she found, and this is, you know, been my experience too, and in the not nearly as extensive research and reading and writing and just conversations I've had with people about Confucius Institutes, there are a few ways in which, what happens at Confucius Institutes and the way they operate do infringe on academic freedom at a university. One is the question of what happens in the classroom and the curriculum. So, even when it's language instruction, and even to be honest, and today, universities that don't have Confucius Institutes may use mainland Chinese textbooks. Some use, textbooks from Taiwan or Hong Kong. But still, you have a particular curriculum and books and teachers that have been pre-vetted by the Chinese Ministry of Education, that are being paid for, that are often being supervised and evaluated, not by the local university, but by the Hanban. And so you kind of can imagine what the different incentives are there. And I think so that, even if it might not be always super obvious what the propagandistic aspects of, the content are, certainly the self-censorship elements are there of like what's not being talked about. And then I think one of the aspects that's really important too is the informal role that teachers play, that the vetted teachers play in terms of a student's, first interaction with China. So again, today is June 4th, and I have a friend who's American who speaks Chinese fluently and teaches at a local high school. And in the past, he's done programs, with his students on June 4th to talk about Tiananmen Square. Of course, a teacher at a Hanban or a Confucius Institute is not going to do that. They're not going to show you the video of the Gate of Heavenly Peace. They're not, but even more than that, let's say a student comes up to them and says, I heard about this thing that happened, what really happened? Well, either because, the teacher really believes this, will repeat the party line, or because, they're afraid. Even if they know the truth, they're afraid that they're going to be reported up. Even in a positive way, this will be like, wow, my Chinese teacher told me what happened in June 4th. And then slowly but surely it gets back to like the Chinese director of the Confucius Institutes and their job, and even, the safety of their family, their own safety when they go back to China could be threatened. So I think, there's, the teachers to some extent from their perspective, they may be caught between a rock and a hard place. They want a new opportunity, but they may not be able to speak freely to their students, even in private. And it's not only about June 4th. Somebody, asked about what, the situation with regards to Falun Gong, asked about the coronavirus. Hey, I heard, I saw on WeChat that the coronavirus originated in the United States, which is basically what Chinese state media have been, propagating, or in Italy, is that true? And then the teacher says yes, because, that's what her sense is, that's the safe answer to give. So I think there's that informal element, which I don't recall for how much Rachelle had looked at that, but I think that's certainly something I've heard from some parents I've spoken to who remove their children, especially, or encourage their children not to take courses at Confucius Institutes or Confucius classrooms, which I'll get to in a moment. So I think there's that aspect. I think the other is the whole issue of economic strings attached and the kind of economic leverage that comes, with regards to the creation of the Confucius Institutes, which often can also be affected by, say, the amount of finances a university receives because of a large influx of Chinese students, and this, broader fear of upsetting China at a university, which can contribute to other forms of self-censorship, of downplaying, of not, of either, again, self-censorship of kind of maybe not, of downplaying, certain aspects, but also maybe even direction, canceling invitations to the Dalai Lama to come and speak on campus, canceling, taking down a photo exhibit that like Students for a Free Tibet or a Falun Gong group did of what was happening in terms of the persecution, art exhibit or an information exhibit. So like I, as an Amnesty International, person in college, we used to do these all the time. And now, I went to a small liberal arts college that didn't have a Confucius Institute, but I could see a situation, where we would try to organize something like that. And we would maybe not get permissions, or we would put it up and somebody gets a phone call. And that did actually happen at the University of Tel Aviv years ago. I went to court and the students won. But I think it shows the way that kind of leverage can be used to impinge upon discussions, both of the academic nature and then kind of student activism on campus. And I think there were two other aspects that really came out from Rachelle's research. One is the lack of transparency. How many of these contracts, and you can go into much more detail about how much or to what extent or not she was able to get, some of the contracts and what are the specific provisions. A lot of lack of transparency, which again, of course, fuels even more suspicions that the universities have conceded in one way or another, either to admitting the one China policy or to agreeing. And in some cases, they'll just agree without even realizing what's in the contract. That we know there are cases of that happening. And then I think the other is an element of discrimination in the hiring of teachers. And there was one very well documented case in Canada of a woman who practiced the Falun Gong meditation practice and then came to Canada as a teacher, and then actually I think sued the university or the Confucius, I think it was the university, for discrimination, because basically in order to become a Confucius Institute teacher, she had to sign something saying that you would not practice Falun Gong. And actually that was one of the first universities where the Confucius Institute was subsequently closed. That was in McGill, I think, right? So I think those are some of the various ways in which you just see and that's not even getting into, I think, some of the emerging, in some cases, less well-documented concerns about surveillance, about the intimidation factor for Chinese students of having a Chinese government entity and representatives on campus. The ways in which, one professor at a university in the United States was expressing to me privately concern that, head of the Confucius Institute was now sitting in like the dean's office or the president's office. So, the amount of information they had access to, but again, also the intimidation factor. If you're a Uyghur, if you're a Tibetan, if you're a Chinese student who may, not have beliefs that are equal to what the Chinese, or perspectives to the Chinese government, that can create a very intimidating environment at our university. So I think there's very much, besides academic freedom, there's very much kind of a student affairs aspect to this as well. And then the last point I was going to make is the way in which we've seen that Confucius Institutes in higher education end up being used as a center to then extend other forms of influence. And I'll mention two briefly. One is Confucius classrooms. And these are K through 12 programs. In some cases, Chinese immersion programs beginning in kindergarten. Now, I remember seeing one of those announced in Arizona. And as the mother of a kindergartner who, like Jonas, is learning Chinese, I was like, what? It really, really shocked me because, of course, on the one hand, sure, it's just Chinese language, but again, it's a much more less, critically minded student population than, say, university students. Much more, I think, vulnerable school boards and the like, who just aren't used to dealing with all this China stuff. Apparently, the Department of Education is really not well equipped to deal with some of these aspects that maybe people over at the State Department or the Defense Department or Homeland Security or the FBI might be a little bit more aware of, but doesn't really make its way over in kind of a interagency process over to the Department of Education. And so I think, and so actually, if you look, and I can talk about this more if people are interested, but there's like actually even more embeddedness and at the K through 12 level, in the way in which Hanban and Confucius classrooms, there are 500 in the United States. There may be less now as more Confucius Institutes have closed, but they actually are more, and when we looked, it was something like in 40 out of 50 states. So it's really throughout, and all kinds of schools, public schools and private schools, again, all kinds of grades. And so I think in a lot of ways, they've actually been able to embed themselves quietly, even more at the K through 12. There's been more pushback at the higher education level. The other aspect is actually the corporate sector. I wrote a piece with somebody for the Jamestown China Brief about this intersection. And it takes a few forms. One, they do outreach to teach Chinese language courses, but also courses on like the Chinese economy and modern life in China for major corporations. So, and that may not necessarily be problematic, but again, it comes with a certain perspective to it. You have some pretty prominent, pretty high-ranking executives from corporations like Microsoft, Walmart. I think Nike were the two examples we found. They were actually on the boards of local Confucius Institutes. So you have various ways in which some of the international corporations are actually supporting CIs. There was one Confucius Institutes in Germany that was actually founded with the help of Audi. And then the third is actually increasing collaboration between Hanban and Chinese tech companies. And so we found this new initiative that started in like December 2018 with a bunch of Chinese tech companies, including Tencent, which is one of the largest tech companies in China and runs apps that are used by over 1 billion people ostensibly, but that are very, very much hand in glove with the Chinese government and Communist Party in terms of surveillance and censorship. And some others, another one, iFlyTech, which is one of the companies that's been seen to have been involved with surveillance and biometric data collection of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, contributing to their detentions. And so basically this collaboration program is to try to bring the technology, facial recognition technologies, voice recognition technologies, ostensibly to help students learn Chinese better, but of course, with all kinds of surveillance concerns and caveats that could be attached to that. So I'll stop there, but I think going back to Steve's point, which was great that you read that quote from Li Changjun, which is that if you look at some of the ways in which the Chinese government is talking about Confucius Institutes, they do specifically say that it's like as a vector for reaching and influencing governments and other key stakeholders within the broader community. So it's really not just limited to higher education.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that really helpful overview of the many ways that Confucius Institutes are involved in higher education, and then with that creeping mandate even beyond. That's a really helpful, it's really helpful to have that list of all the things that you mentioned there. I want to kick off the discussion by talking about the United Front motto that Jonas brought up, make the foreign serve China. It's a really revealing quote and kind of a helpful way to think through Confucius Institutes and Thousand Talents Plan and other forms of Chinese government influence or interference. I often look at the Hanban's influence and see it as kind of trying to corner the market on Chinese language education to, first of all, send in these waves of Chinese government sponsored teachers who can provide kind of the early Chinese language instruction while the US still has a deficiency, not enough Chinese language teachers. And then at the second level, to try to corner the market on training teachers of Chinese, so that even as the US and other countries are building up their own institutions that can teach Chinese language, the Hanban has a role in shaping those and developing those, and just will leave their mark on them to come for time to come. So make the foreign serve China. Is this what we're seeing happening with American higher education? Is it increasingly being, is the Chinese government being successful to an extent in trying to have our institutions of higher education serve the Chinese government interest? Any thoughts on that?
And that question is addressed to?
Any of you three, Sarah, Steve, and Jonas.
All right, well, I'll take a crack at it first, and then everybody else can join in. The interesting thing about, one of the interesting things for me about the Confucius Institutes, of course, is they teach simplified characters. Every language draws a magic circle around the people who speak it. And if you can control language, of course, as everyone knows, you can control how issues are framed, you can control the narrative, you can rewrite history. It's a tool with 1,000 uses. And there is a Chinese saying that history is a maiden, and you can dress her up however you like. And the Chinese Communist Party dresses up history in a very, very interesting garb of one peasant rebellion after another, and puts itself as the glorious savior of the Chinese people. Now, if you grow up, if you learn Chinese from people who are teaching that, whether or not they believe it or not, it inhibits your ability to think clearly about China as a whole. And if you learn only simplified characters, it limits your ability to read newspapers in Taiwan or in Hong Kong or in Singapore, where they still use traditional characters. It's easy to go from, by the way, traditional characters to simplified characters. It's a lot harder to go the other way. So I think there's a hidden linguistic element in the language instruction as well that most people wouldn't note. What is surprising to me, of course, is how eager the administrators of American major universities are to not only accept, but to actively solicit donations from one of the worst violators of human rights on the planet, from one of the, in terms of the number of people killed by the Chinese Communist Party, we can say that it's probably one of the most bloodthirsty regimes that has ever existed in human history. And you know, this pursuit of money on the part of institutions like Stanford, where I used to be, and Harvard and Yale, which have endowments in the billions of dollars, is really baffling to me. All students at major elite universities should attend tuition free on the merit of their matriculation characteristics. They shouldn't be paying any tuition at all. But what the Department of Education has done recently is it has sent a letter to all colleges and universities in the United States asking them to abide by the law, which requires them to list the source of all donations over $250,000. And in that letter, the Department of Education described elite institutions of higher education as, quote, multi-billion-dollar, multinational enterprises using opaque foundations, foreign campuses, and other sophisticated structures to generate revenue, which I think is not a description that we would normally associate with, say, Harvard University. We would associate it perhaps with Boeing or with Apple, but we wouldn't associate with institutions of higher education. But in fact, they seem to be driven more by a search for money in some cases than a search for the truth, at least in terms of the development department. But the more important question for me is, what does the Communist Party receive in return for its investments, its partnerships, its cooperative agreements with American universities, whether they be cooperative agreements for the purpose of setting up a Confucius Institute or cooperative agreements in terms of setting up a satellite campus in China, or a cooperative agreement allowing Chinese researchers to study in American labs. You know, the Communist Party is not known for its philanthropy. There is always a quid pro quo. And I think the payback for China, for the Chinese Communist Party, because we're not talking here about the Chinese people, who are the first and foremost victims of the Chinese Communist Party's violation of human rights. We're talking about the 94 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, and most specifically about the elite in that political party. I think the payback for the Chinese Communist Party comes in many forms. It comes in form of the opportunity to steal research, and like they do with their 1,000 Talents program. It comes with the opportunity to disseminate propaganda, which they do through the Confucius Institutes. It comes with the opportunity to influence faculty hiring decisions, and even to weigh in on US foreign policy debates. I mean, some of what China gets from its donations to American universities, which as of right now, total about $900 million that have been admitted. I think there's a lot of donations that universities still have to reveal. Some universities have cooperated with the Department of Education's request for information. Others have refused, and I think it's going to go into litigation. But close to $1 billion now have come into American universities. And some of what they get is obvious. They get, of course, the theft of high tech from US university labs. They get the recruitment of US scientists to participate in the 1,000 Talents program. You already mentioned the Harvard professor Charles Lieber and his contract, very generous contract. One of the things that you didn't note, however, was that his contract called for him not only to set up a lab in China and train 3 to 4 researchers, China researchers in that lab there in Wuhan, the famous city of Wuhan. It also called for him to train 3 or 4 Chinese researchers a year in his lab in the United States of America. And what was he doing in his lab? He was implanting microchips in the brains of laboratory animals, principally mice and rats. And he had developed a micropore structure in which to implant a microchip in the brain that would not generate an immune response, which could stay in place and interact on the neuronal level with the brain of the rat and mice for a long time, for at least a year or two, and influence the actions of the laboratory rats. Now, why would the Chinese Communist Party be interested in a technology that would allow them to implant microchips in the brains of mammals? I will leave you with that and go on to say, the flood of Communist Party money is corrosive in many respects. It enables, among other things, the elite Communist Party members to place their children and grandchildren at American elite universities. We all know probably that Xi Jinping's own daughter went to Harvard under an assumed name several years ago. And of course, her matriculation at Harvard's, America's premier university, Harvard, meant that there was one less spot available for an intelligent and hardworking young woman from America. So there's a cost, an opportunity cost to be paid when things like this happen. And then, of course, you have the fact, I think we've already mentioned the case of Drew Pavlov at the University of Queensland, and the Chinese embassy mobilized the Chinese Student Association on campus to not only demonstrate against his peaceful demonstration in favor of freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. They actually assaulted Drew and his fellow demonstrators, and there were embassy personnel present at the protest encouraging them on. This is obviously a violation of the diplomatic status. They should have been expelled. But you can see that Chinese student groups have been mobilized as part of the United Front effort on university campuses, which may be a little resistant to shutting them down, or at least restricting their activities. Why? Because they're getting money directly and indirectly from the Chinese Communist Party. And I'll end on this point. People talk about the private sector and the public sector in China. There are mom and pop stores in China that the Communist Party pays no attention to, but any company of any size with 50 or more employees has to have a Communist Party cell set up with a Communist Party secretary in charge of the cell. Any company with a board of directors has to have 1% of its stock or more sold to the Communist Party, and a member of the Communist Party has to sit on the board of directors. So I would argue that there are no major or medium-sized companies in China that are private. They're all controlled directly or indirectly by the Chinese Communist Party. So when you receive donations from Huawei, for example, as many campuses in Canada have, including the University of British Columbia, you're receiving money that was a directed donation from the Communist Party itself.
The one thing I would say to follow up on that and on Rachelle's question is, I think at universities we see a real distinction often between the faculty and the administration, where the administration, partly because they're dealing with the money side of things, are more likely and eager to cooperate, to have a Confucius Institute and to cooperate with the Chinese government. Whereas I think you see faculty members, whether it's before or during or after a Confucius Institute comes on campus, expressing real concerns about the academic freedom dimensions, about the impact for students. And of course, you do see a lot of faculty members all over the United States publishing all kinds of research and commentary that's quite critical of the Chinese government. Although that can also be limited by the Chinese government in China, by limiting people's visas, by putting pressure or endangering sources, which academics in the United States obviously don't want to endanger in the course of their research, shutting archives and the like. So there are a lot of restrictions on academic scholarship in the United States that are directly handed down by the Chinese government because of intimidation or limits on access to research in China. But I think one of the things you've seen, for example, is both the National Association of Scholars and the American Association of Professors, which have both very early on come out and said that, we really think Confucius Institutes are not a good idea and should be shut down. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about the degree to which, how much has the Chinese Communist Party been able to get a foothold You obviously have examples of individual faculty member who have perhaps been co-opted in one way or another, but you do also have a lot of faculty that are very concerned, and a lot of faculty that may be concerned but may not be able to speak up. I think one of the things that Rachelle found also was that part of the self-censorship that was happening at universities with Confucius Institutes was self-censorship around the Confucius Institute. That there was a sense that if you were a professor who was not tenured yet in particular, and Rachelle, correct me if I'm not remembering this right, not tenured yet, you were wary about speaking up too publicly against the Confucius Institute because you're worried that that would be frowned upon by the administration, by various other individuals who would be making decisions about your promotion prospects or your ability to receive tenure. So I think that's also an indication to which not only of the academic freedom restrictions, but again, the distance between certain parts of a university and certain other parts of the university.
Maybe just then to chip in one point on sort of Steve's pretty good, I thought, outlay of why is the Chinese Communist Party interested in this and what sort of their quid pro quo. I would also say there's like an overall ambition, which is of course to make sort of the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. So there's also one which doesn't have necessarily a quid pro quo, but is really just adding white noise, just quelling our critical China debate and adding other courses that are innocuous, like Sarah's example with the political economy. So it doesn't even have to be propaganda. It's just that it's then not talking about Tiananmen, not talking about the treaties, and so just basically filling the space in and around China with something that's sort of innocuous. So I think that's maybe sort of the most pervasive of it, where you can't really say, is this, that if you look at it sort of face value, is this course necessarily sort of bad or preaching communist ideology? Maybe not, but it's just like filling out the space on China so that there isn't, and taking up that space. I think that's on the overall of the ambitions, also a really sort of long-term plan. And then I really like Sarah's distinction between faculty and administration. I think we have to, when we discuss these issues, look at the sort of the money incentives that there are in the different structures. And that's really also what the Chinese Communist Party has found out, is that that's also why there's so much of this in business, that it's through money. And you see actually a complete similar distinction in newspapers, where you can get interviewed by all the great China journalists at the New York Times or Washington Post and so on, but then their advertising department do take these sort of inserts from the China Daily that of course has this small health warning that this is a advertisement supplement, but I mean, made off as an article, and in the print version inside the newspaper, and actually now in the electronic version, sometimes even worse, because they're the sort of health labeling that you're reading Communist Party propaganda is even less sort of visible for people that scroll through the electronic version. But again, there you have that same tension that when you then ask the journalist, they're like, yeah, I'm against that, but it's kind of our department that takes that decision. And I think the Chinese United Front activities are really, really good at looking at these sort of, where is it you can actually funnel money in the system, and where there is a vulnerability and an openness to it. So I think that's also important when we start talking about how do you then change this, then it's also looking at what is it, what sort of money incentives is it that there is during the system that the Chinese are able to play on.
Yeah, let's talk about the money and transparency aspect, which everyone has raised at different points in this conversation. Jonas, at the beginning, you raised a distinction between influence and interference, and you said influence is when we know that it's being funded or put forward by the Chinese government, and interference is when it's covert. But sometimes, even with influence, that it may say, you know, this insert is funded by China. It may say that in the newspaper, and the university, when it sets up a Confucius Institute, it may technically be reporting those funds to the Department of Education, but we also know many universities are not disclosing those funds. It can be tricky, even with transparency, to know who's really behind this. So what should transparency look like surrounding Chinese government funding and other sources of influence, and is transparency enough? Thoughts from any of you three on that?
I mean, you could change some rules as well in a report I wrote a while back with the Hudson Institute. I mean, what the Department of Education is now doing with the 250 requirement, you could lower that as well. So that would make it down to 50,000 or even less, so that you would really have to see the full gamut of gift and donations to universities, and of course coupled with the sort of increased transparency requirements. Then it would be great to see also beyond transparency among universities, maybe try to make sort of code of conducts. I've suggested something similar, you know, for newspapers with the ads, that they should make a code of conduct there and say for all sort of serious journalism that they're not going to take these inserts. So that could be also as well a way of sort of strengthening the hand of some universities, that they don't feel they sort of negotiate on their own, and so that could be some of the ways to go sort of beyond just transparency. And then of course, as I said earlier, and that's maybe where my European side kicks in with Confucius Institutes, when you close them down, I mean, I do think you need to offer universities, either through public or private funding, some other alternatives to offer independent China language and research. So that I think is actually something that, not just in the US, but in other democracies as well, we should look at doing some of that, maybe jointly, of saying, could you help to sort of establish more China research that's independent of Chinese funding?
Yeah, I would say, I think when Rachelle's report first came out, we had done some meetings together on the Hill, and I think there was certain wording for the Higher Education Act, I think, about lowering that bar. So I think in terms of increasing the reporting, I think there was also an idea of having certain types of contributions in kind be able to be counted, so that, you know, it might be that the actual cash donation being made by a Confucius Institute, you know, is below a certain bar, and they may, you know, even ensure that in order to get around some of the transparency requirements. But if you add in the teachers' salaries, for example, and maybe some of the books and other contributions in kind that come as part of the whole package, then that starts to become a much larger number. So that would be one thing. I think otherwise, I think one of the things that was really good about and thoughtful in Rachelle's report was that besides recommending closure of the institutes, you also gave a range of different recommendations and ideas for suggestions for what universities who did decide to keep other Confucius Institutes could and should do to have them align better with academic freedom requirements, whether it was, and I may not have remembered all of these off the top of my head, but I think some of them were, you know, like having them actually be supervised by academics, not giving credit for the courses. And so I think, you know, there are various actions that even universities who are not closing their Confucius Institutes, you know, could take to align on the side of better practices. And then I think the other thing I would say is that, you know, besides the shifts and the closures in the United States, there have been a number of factors, I think. Some of it are specific, you know, North America, specific scandals or incidents that have caused an uproar. In other cases, it's been pressure from national level lawmakers, senators, or members of Congress writing to universities urging them to close. There have been campaigns from the bottom up from groups like Students for a Free Tibet and others. And then there was this provision that was put in the National Defense Authorization Act that kind of creates limitations on the amount of, I think, funding or opportunities that a university can receive from the Department of Defense if it also is taking money, especially for Chinese language instruction, from the Hanba. So I think even universities who have maybe not, unless you get a waiver, maybe not, might not violate those provisions, have decided to err on the side of caution and their Confucius Institutes. But actually, if you look globally, you also see closures, like the example in Sweden, which was there was also Confucius classrooms affiliated with some of those institutes that were just closed in the last few months. And then even on the media side, I think one of the things we've seen, particularly during the pandemic, is the aggressiveness and the forms of disinformation that are being spread, and outright just falsehoods and manipulated information being spread by Chinese state media, have been just that much clearer and more dramatic for people who don't maybe understand some of the nuances. And so there was actually I think BuzzFeed wrote a report about how the Telegraph in the UK was running these inserts from People's Daily and the China Daily on their website. And I agree with Jonas. It's so much, it's actually more insidious than the print editions, because it's even harder to be able to tell that this is different from the main reporting of the paper. And, you know, they didn't publicly admit it, I don't think, but a few days after that article came out, they apparently had discontinued the partnership. And I think I had heard that even like the New York Times, there were definitely 2 recent articles in the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. So I would say if you're subscribers to those papers, you can write them letters and say that you're paying your subscription to read their content and you don't want to read Chinese government propaganda as well. But I think like the New York Times, maybe there have been some, I think, you know, again, nobody's come out and said it necessarily declared it publicly, but I think you are starting to see some pushback and maybe some, qualms, even on the side of the advertising departments of some of these news outlets about taking the money for those and publishing those inserts.
I'll jump in on this since I asked the question about transparency. As Sarah mentioned, we have at NAS been advocating for a lot stricter transparency requirements, for the threshold for disclosure to be lowered, for in-kind gifts to be disclosed, just for a lot more transparency from all nations who are giving gifts to higher education, and you'd be able to see where that money comes from. But we're also seeing that universities are not complying with existing transparency disclosures. Many of them haven't been reporting funds for years. The Department of Education is just now starting to step up enforcement and opening investigations into colleges and universities. And several of them are pushing back and are apparently claiming to the Department of Education that their contracts and funding relationships are trade secrets and it's proprietary information that they can't share with the Department of Education in disregard of existing transparency laws. So definitely I think a lot more transparency is needed, but one concern that we have at NAS is just transparency is important, but it's not sufficient protection. Confucius Institutes, even if you can go look up the Department of Education's database and see how much money they brought into a particular university, to the student walking around campus, the Confucius Institute class is pretty much just another class on campus. And the institute itself, in the ways that Sarah described, it's influencing the rest of the university. It's forcing faculty to self-censor. It's creating incentives for the administration to speak and behave a certain way. Although initially we did have some recommendations about how to carefully operate a Confucius Institute and try to keep it contained, we've now reached the conclusion that there really isn't a good way to do that, and closing Confucius Institutes is pretty much the only way to protect higher education. I want to turn to a couple of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. So we have a question here: how much danger are individual Chinese students in from overreaction to this party influence? I have a PhD student who attended Beijing Institute of Technology, a university that has military ties, who is concerned that he will be kicked out of the US because of this, even though he has no connection to the army or party. This is harkening back to what Jonas was saying, and we need to be careful that we're not just saying anybody Chinese is a threat, that it has to be more narrowly tailored than that. But any comments from the panelists in response to this? How much danger are individual Chinese students in as a result?
Go ahead, Steve.
I think individual Chinese students are in great danger from the Chinese Communist Party because their families remain at home And if they in any way criticize the party's policy towards the United States or towards its own people, or if they were trying to publicly make a statement about Tiananmen or Tibet, they would be in trouble. And of course, the party practices the principle of collective punishment. And so you're here, temporarily at least, in the United States, so you're supposedly beyond their reach, but your family members are not. And your family members will be threatened. And possibly there have been cases where family members, brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters have been arrested and held hostage until the offending Chinese dissident returns back to the People's Republic of China to face justice. So I think that's where the pressure comes from. Of course, we're all aware of the recent rule that if you're a serving member of the People's Liberation Army and you're here doing research and some sensitive aspect of technology, you will be asked to leave. And I think that the United States is enforcing that rule right now. I found it interesting, the Chinese embassy just a couple of days ago sent out a public instruction in Chinese, not English, to all of the students in science and technology fields who had a connection with the People's Liberation Army. And it told them that each of them would be, I thought it interesting, each of them will be connected individually to the local China Airlines flight and have their tickets booked. And it also instructed them that when they went through US Customs, they should be very careful about their cell phones, computers, and other electronic devices because they might be searched. So it seems to me the Chinese embassy knows perfectly well who all the people on the list are because they sent them here. And the ones that are being asked to leave probably been clearly identified. I think if they weren't, I think if there were any anomalous cases, we would have heard about that already.
I think I think it gets tricky because I think there's two things here. There's the short-term issue and the longer-term issue. And I think the shorter-term issue is that some of these Chinese students are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. And I think it's not really my area of expertise, but I think, you know, you do see in some cases some of these rules being perhaps a bit too sweeping or not leaving room perhaps for sufficient, again, I don't know if the level of waivers or things like that, if there are certain you know, appeals that individual students can make and the like. You know, and students, they came to the United States and they made certain decisions in their life back in China, you know, based on certain assumptions about what was permitted and what was not, and what would close the door to their coming to study in the United States and what would not. I think one of the things you've seen recently in the media sphere is that is tightening rules for journalists of Chinese nationality. To be honest, even if they don't work for Chinese state media, which I think is very problematic because you have some very good Chinese journalists working for outlets that are actually quite critical of the Chinese government. So I think there are ways in which the way the current administration is going about some of these rules are not nuanced enough and end up backfiring in ways that could be problematic. But I think the longer term impact or perhaps intent of some of these rules is that it can kind of try to change some of the incentives. So if you're a Chinese student in the sciences and you want to you know, be able to study in the United States, then maybe you will think twice about, you know, joining the PLA. And maybe you will think twice about, you know, it may affect your decisions earlier on. And so I think, you know, if you're looking at future generations of Chinese students, then this is just part of the playing field and they need to make those decisions. And I think those kinds of, you know, that can reduce, you know, some of the risks, you know, in the United States. I think in the immediate term, it really does create a situation where some Chinese students are very much stuck between a rock and the hard place. And I think, you know, it would be better if the administration could be a bit more nuanced or try to figure out a way to perhaps not be quite as sweeping and try to figure out a way for students who, you know, to try to differentiate, because the vast majority of Chinese students who have come to the United States over the last 30 years have stayed here. I think it's a little bit different now. Some a bit more go back to China, but you really do have a lot of people who do actually stay and become Americans and leave in part to escape the Chinese Communist Party.
I think you're absolutely right on that point, Sarah. I do think there's been a generational shift, however, in the kind of Chinese students we get here. The Chinese students who came in the 80s and 90s came from a country that was still, in many regions of the country, were desperately poor. Of course, China has not eliminated poverty, but these were students who had lived through the Cultural Revolution, perhaps as very young children, or heard from their parents the horrors of those days. And they were eager to experience America, not just to come and study, get a STEM degree, but also to understand the American experience in liberty and respect for human rights and so forth. And I think over the last 20 years, the character of the Chinese students who come over here has shifted. And I know this is a generalization, and all generalizations are to some extent false, but the students who come here now are most often now the sons and daughters of privilege. They're the sons and daughters of Communist Party officials who have made a lot of money, not from their official salaries, which are fairly limited, but from corruption, from preying off the hard-earned dollars of the Chinese people. And they have a very different attitude towards the United States. They are here for instrumental reasons only. They're here only to learn science and technology in many cases, and only to learn it in order to take it back to China, where it can be monetized. So again, another sweeping generalization, but I think it's true. You see, I used to see in the 80s and 90s, I used to see Chinese students renting an apartment, and there would be a dozen of them in the apartment. Now I see Chinese students driving, the latest model cars and having unlimited expense accounts and so forth. I mean, Meng Wanzhou, the CEO of Huawei, who is currently being held under house arrest in Vancouver, waiting to be extradited to the United States. Her son is going to school, I think, at Harvard, and probably has a pretty unlimited expense account. Now, I would also say this about Chinese students. Remember, there are only so many students who can be admitted into so many classes. And so when you choose one student, you're rejecting the others who've applied for the same spot. It is impossible to verify the academic qualifications of Chinese students. Cheating on the TOEFL, cheating on the standardized test is rampant. You can easily buy a forged transcript. There's no way for the admissions department of Yale or Harvard to check and see whether or not the academic qualifications that the students from China are submitting are actually accurate. We can check on the academic qualifications of students from Western countries, from Latin America, from almost everywhere else in the world. The Chinese academic establishment is a black hole in that sense. So we don't know what we're getting, number one. Number two, we need more STEM graduates in the United States, science, technology, engineering majors in the United States. We have to bring in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands each year because we don't produce enough here. So I'm all in favor of restricting people who come here to study from China to non-STEM majors, all right? They can study politics, they can study American history, they can study world history, they can study anything they want, but we ought to reserve the STEM majors for qualified Americans, especially qualified Americans from minority communities who are terribly underrepresented in those fields, and we should be reaching out a helping hand to them. Again, there are opportunity costs here, and if I weigh the value of training a deserving minority against the value of training a rich kid from China who's only there because of a forged transcript, hey, I picked the guy from our local neighborhood over him any day.
Eva, I don't know if you have seen NAS's new policy document called Critical Care. It's specifically about the proposed bailout of higher education in the wake of the pandemic and the shutdown and the way that colleges have been financially hurt because of that. But you're kind of channeling a lot of our recommendations that we have in there. We have a section on American national interest, and one of the recommendations is that if colleges are going to seek bailout funding from Congress, they should, as a condition of receiving that, close down their Confucius Institute, but also prioritize American students in their graduate programs, especially in STEM. So I commend that to all our audience members, critical care. It's NIS's new policy report on federal policy in the wake of the shutdown. Let me turn to another question that came in. How can an individual faculty member who advises many Chinese students be sure that he is not a conduit for the theft of technology? I think one obvious answer is don't sign up for the 1,000 Talents plan or any other talent plan from the Chinese government. But are there any other things that panelists would recommend?
Common sense is a good start. I mean, if you see something that's dodgy, then maybe it's dodgy. But I mean, so if you're working on something that you know is a sensitive area, AI and nanotechnology and so on, then of course you would have some more prudence sort of around this. If it's not, then of course we shouldn't also paint sort of red scares. I mean, there are lots of other areas that are just of sort of global common good. So it really depends on the area.
My answer is a little, I think that's, you know, I would second that, and I don't have that much experience with this, but my answer would be a little different, which is, and this can also be really delicate, but actually trying to have conversations with them about China and sharing with them or introducing them to alternative sources of information that they may or may not hear. Because a Chinese student who knows what really happened on June 4th, or who realizes what's actually happening to Uyghurs, or who sees some of the other things that have been happening in China, I think they're just, you know, their perspective on the government changes. And I think, again, you don't know, and again, they can be stuck between a rock and a hard place. But I think that's generally something that, you know, would be good. You know, I think there isn't enough of that being done with regard to not only Chinese students, but I think other foreign students from countries that are less than democratic, is really not only introducing the aspects of our system or democracy overall, but really trying to, you know, it's so powerful. Some of the conversations I've had with Chinese friends of like, how the light like went off when they actually learned what really happened on June 4th, and they saw the footage, and it just breaks this dam and makes them question, you know, it can be really difficult, and makes them question so much of what they feel they know. But I think somebody who's gone through that type of transition is going to be more aware of, you know, and more resistant to demands. Again, you don't know if they've already been sent. I think in some cases, you know, people are here and then they get tapped and they're getting intimidated. But it just seems like that could be one way of, you know, it would do good anyway, probably. And of course, they may have, you know, it can be a two-way street, various understanding and perspectives and questions, and things that, you know, that would change our understanding of China and you know, what maybe they've experienced firsthand in their lives. But I think that is the kind of conversation that might be useful, you know, and that can give them a better understanding of how the Communist Party works, and the kind of, and maybe help inoculate them against being taken advantage of in that kind of a way that again also puts them in danger if they're caught.
Let me ask one more question here from the Q&A list. How can American colleges and universities support our colleagues in Taiwan and Hong Kong at this time?
Well, I would make a distinction between Taiwan and Hong Kong, because Taiwan is really a thriving democracy that is under constant threat by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. And, you know, we don't exactly know. There are always missiles pointing at Taiwan. You never know when there's going to be some kind of Chinese aggression, and there's disinformation attacks ahead of the elections. But I would say, you know, the academic, you know, academia in Taiwan is very robust. Hong Kong is a very different story, because Hong Kong is really standing on the precipice now, after a national security law was basically shoved down the throat of the territory by the National People's Congress in Beijing, bypassing Hong Kong's legislature. And so I think now there's been some real serious consideration with regards to, certainly in the UK and maybe elsewhere, of there being, in Taiwan, in fact, of there being potentially a flood of various refugees, political refugees seeking asylum from Hong Kong. And so I think for the academic perspective, I mean, definitely college students as well as faculty members have been very active, in the pro-democracy movement there and in anti-government protests last year. And some have, like Benny Tai, have charges against them and are facing, their own political prosecutions already, but there are others that are not. And so I think there are some programs like there's the Scholars at Risk, I think that's out of NYU. I think there's another one I can't remember, which is basically a program for scholars from different countries who face a risk to get some kind of fellowship, to leave the country, to come to the United States and to work at a partner university. And I think that the way it works is that some of the costs are split, say, like between the host university and the program. So I think if, for example, this is something you're concerned about, that might be something to try to find the right person at your university, or maybe it's even by department. I don't know exactly how it works. To reach out to Scholars in Risk and say, if you're working on any kind of, plans, or you have someone from Hong Kong with these or that qualifications, please keep us in mind as a possible host university. And, that's at a very, individual level, but that's certainly something that that could really help, in very practical terms, some of the scholars in Hong Kong and their families that that may already be facing risks, but that when this law really comes into effect could even more be in trouble.
Thank you. We're just about ready to wrap up here. I want to give the panelists one last opportunity if there's anything else you want to share or if you should be mentioned here.
Can I just come back to the Tiananmen massacre and the fact that we're now 31 years down the road from that terrible tragedy. The brave students in Tiananmen Square demanded political reforms to make the government more transparent, more responsible. What did the communist regime do? Well, Zhao Zhiyang wanted to negotiate, and Deng Xiaoping came out of retirement and called in the troops and the tanks. As a result, political reform ceased, and the government, I think, over time has become even more blatant in its repression and its corruption. And we find ourselves today in the middle of a pandemic. But, it's very clear that when the coronavirus first broke out in Wuhan, escaping, as I believe, from a lab there, if there had been any space in society, any space in government to sound the alarm, if the Communist Party had not suppressed the truth and punished whistleblowers and misled the world, hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. And by the same token, if the Chinese Communist Party, instead of slaughtering the Tiananmen protesters, had accepted their request for political reform, their legitimate request, the world would be a very, very different place. So again, these are two examples of where the regime has run roughshod over its own people, and and now the world have paid a price. So I think we're in, sadly, a generational struggle with the Chinese Communist Party. I didn't anticipate that we would be in another struggle like this in my lifetime. When the Berlin Wall came down, I celebrated. I went there. I helped set up Radio Free Asia back in the early 90s to broadcast news and information to China, thinking it would only be a few years before the Chinese people would enjoy the same freedom that the countries of Eastern Europe now enjoy. That hasn't happened. Things have moved dramatically in the other direction, and we have to be aware of that. Those of us, I know all of us, are concerned about the Chinese people, have many friends in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. And of course, we wish the best for all of them. And with that, I'll turn it over to the other panelists.
Jonas or Sarah, do you have any final comments you want to make? If not, that's fine.
I'll just say again, read Rachelle's report.
I'll second that. I worked with Rachelle when I was at the Hudson Institute, and benefited from you, Rachelle, as well for some of our internal discussions on these topics. And it's, of course, maybe to end where I started, it's a topic that goes way beyond education. So it's, of course, a much broader topic of how we sort of look at the Chinese Communist Party, both influence and interference operations in democracies, and what we can do to counter them. And there are some difficult dilemmas as well, because otherwise our action can become sort of too sweeping, and we also then close off too many contacts with China. I mean, we had too much of the unconditional engagement, but of course, I don't think we should cut off all engagement either.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, Steve, and Jonas, for joining us here. Thank you to all of you who joined this webinar. I hope it was helpful to you. Please do look at Freedom House Population Research Institute, and Jonas, you are now at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. I know you're working the Hudson Institute as well. Do check out the work of these panelists who have done so much research and commentary on these issues. You can also look at the NAS website, nas.org, where we have our report on Confucius Institutes. Thank you all for joining. We hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.